The sun was not a friend in this part of the West. It was a hammer, beating down on the cracked, thirsty earth from a sky the color of faded denim, bleached white at the horizons. The wind was a thief, picking up the topsoil and flinging it into the air, a constant, gritty haze that settled on everything, in the folds of your clothes, the corners of your eyes, the back of your throat. It was a land of sharp edges and muted colors, where the streams ran thin and brown, and the cattle were walking skeletons, their ribs showing like the teeth of a comb through their dusty hides. Hope was a currency scarcer than water. It was in this unforgiving landscape that Eleanor moved, a single point of youthful grace against a backdrop of decay. At 18, she carried the weight of her world in 2 wooden buckets, sloshing with water she'd drawn from the deep well a quarter-mile from their sod house. The yoke across her shoulders dug into the worn fabric of her dress, a familiar ache that mirrored the one in her heart. With every step, her bare feet sank into the fine, hot dust. She kept her eyes fixed on the distant, hazy line where the plains met the sky, a place that existed only in her imagination, a place with soil dark and rich, with trees that offered deep, cool shade, and with rain that fell clean from the heavens. Her gaze was distant, filled with a longing so fierce it was almost a physical thing, a hunger to escape the poverty that clung to her family like the dust itself. Inside the small, dim house, her father, John, sat at the table, his shoulders slumped in the permanent posture of a man who had fought the land and lost. Her mother, Mary, was wringing her hands in her apron, her face a mask of worry. The cause of their anxiety lay on the table, a letter carried by stagecoach from a town 2 days' ride away. The stationery was thick and cream-colored, a stark contrast to their rough-hewn wooden table. It was from a man named Silas Blackwood. Silas Blackwood was a name spoken with a mixture of envy and fear. He was a cattle baron, a landowner whose property stretched as far as the eye could see, a man who had built an empire from dust and bone. He was also old, nearly 60, with a face like a weathered map and a limp from a long-ago bull-goring. He had buried 2 wives, the last one over a decade ago. The letter, written in a clerk's neat hand, was direct and devoid of sentiment. It stated that Mr. Blackwood was seeking a new wife. He required, it said, a young woman of good health and sound character to see to the needs of his household, and, it was implied with stark clarity, to provide him with further heirs. He had seen Eleanor once, during a rare trip to their small settlement for supplies, and had made inquiries. The letter was an offer, a business proposition. He would forgive the crippling debt John had incurred buying the very plot of land that was now failing them, a debt held by Blackwood himself. In exchange, he would take Eleanor as his wife. That evening, her mother came to her as she mended a tear in her father's shirt by the faint light of a tallow candle. Mary did not command. She pleaded. Her voice, usually taut with the strain of survival, was now soft and wet with tears that tracked clean paths through the dust on her cheeks. "Eleanor, my child," she began, her hand trembling as she touched her daughter's arm. "You are a good girl, a dutiful daughter." Eleanor kept her eyes on her needlework, her stitches small and tight. "What do you want, Mama?" "This is a chance," Mary whispered, her voice cracking. "A chance to save us, Mr. Blackwood is a wealthy man. You would want for nothing. We would be free of this debt that chokes your father every night." "He is older than Papa," Eleanor said, her voice flat. "They say he is a hard man." "They say he is a successful man," her mother corrected, her tone gaining a desperate edge. "He offers you a home, security. Think of it, Eleanor. No more hauling water under that cruel sun. No more wondering if the corn will fail again. You would have dresses made of fine cloth. You would eat meat every day." The words were meant to be temptations, but they landed like stones in Eleanor's stomach. She finally looked up, her clear blue eyes meeting her mother's. "He wants a servant and a broodmare, not a wife." Mary flinched as if struck. The tears came freely now. How can you be so selfish? Is your own comfort all you think of? We have given you everything. Your father has broken his back on this worthless soil. I have worn my fingers to the bone for you. Is it so much to ask that you do this one thing for your family? To sacrifice, as a good woman should, for the survival of her own blood? Your father's name is on that paper. Eleanor, we will lose everything. We will be cast out with nothing but the clothes on our backs. Is that what you want? Each word was a nail being hammered into the coffin of her dreams. She looked past her mother to where her father sat, his head in his hands, a broken man. The weight of his failure, of her mother's fear, of their collective desperation, settled upon her shoulders, heavier than any water yoke. She was trapped, a life of servitude to a stranger, or a life of starvation with her family. There was no third path. She lowered her head again, the candle flame blurring through her own tears. She gave a nod, so small it was almost a shiver. It was enough. Her mother let out a sob of relief, clutching her daughter in a fierce, grateful hug that felt more like a cage closing around her. The wedding, if one could call it that, took place a week later. There was no white dress, only Eleanor's best Sunday frock, a faded calico that had been let out twice. There was no music, only the shuffling of feet on the dusty floor of the preacher's small office and the ever-present sigh of the wind outside. Silas Blackwood stood beside her, smelling of dust, old wool, and something faintly medicinal. He was shorter than she'd expected, but broader, with a thick neck and hands that looked powerful enough to snap a branch in two. His eyes, small and dark, assessed her as if she were a new filly he was purchasing at auction. The few townspeople who witnessed the event looked on with a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. Their whispers followed her like flies. Poor thing, sold by her own father. He'll wear her out in a year, just like the last one. Eleanor stood rigid, her face pale and emotionless, her vows a barely audible whisper. The cold, dry touch of Silas's hand as he placed a simple gold band on her finger made her skin crawl. It felt less like a ring and more like a manacle. The journey to his ranch was made in a sturdy carriage, a luxury she had never experienced. The leather seats were cracked but comfortable, a world away from the hard plank of a farm wagon. Silas sat beside her, the silence stretching between them. He seemed to be making an effort to be gentle, an effort that was clumsy and unsettling. "The land out here is hard," he said, his voice a low rumble. "But it rewards those who are strong enough to tame it. My first wife, she was not strong enough." He glanced at Eleanor. "You look strong." She said nothing, keeping her gaze fixed on the passing, monotonous landscape. He pointed to a vast stretch of grazing land, dotted with hundreds of cattle. "All this is mine, from the river to the mesas. It takes a firm hand to manage it, a firm hand to manage everything." He shifted on the seat and placed a heavy hand on her knee. It was not a gesture of affection. It was a gesture of ownership. "You'll learn the ways of my house. It is a large house. It requires order. You will see that order is kept." He tried to smile, but it was a grimace that didn't reach his cold eyes. "You are a pretty thing. A bit skinny, but we'll fatten you up. It's good to have something young and fresh in the house again." He patted her knee, a gesture one might give to a dog. When they finally arrived at the ranch house, it was larger than any building she had ever seen. A 2-story wooden structure, sprawling and imposing, with a wide porch and shuttered windows that looked like sleeping eyes. Inside, it was dark and smelled of stale air and beeswax. The furniture was heavy and ornate, covered in dust cloths. It was the house of a man who had lived alone for a very long time. That night, in a vast, cold bedroom dominated by a massive 4-poster bed. The transaction was completed. There was no tenderness, no whisper of comfort. It was a brief, clumsy business in the dark, an act of duty on her part, an assertion on his. As soon as it was over, he rolled away from her and, within minutes, The sound of his heavy, rhythmic snores filled the room. Eleanor lay perfectly still, her eyes wide open in the darkness. The moonlight streamed through the window, painting a silver rectangle on the wooden floorboards. She felt a profound and terrifying loneliness, the likes of which she had never known. She was a wife, but she was not a partner. She was a mistress of a grand house, but she had no home. A tear escaped and traced a cold path down her temple into her hair. Then another, and another. She cried without a sound, her body trembling with the silent grief of a life that had ended before it had ever truly begun. She was not Mrs. Blackwood. She was simply the last and most expensive of his acquisitions. Life on the Blackwood Ranch settled into a routine as rigid and unyielding as the winter ground. The house, for all its size, was a vessel of silence. Days were marked not by hours, but by the quiet tyranny of bells, one to wake, one for meals, one for the locking of the doors at dusk. Eleanor was the lady of this vast, lonely manor, a title that felt like a bitter joke. She was its most prized prisoner. Her duties were simple: to oversee the household, a task already performed with grim efficiency by the housekeeper, a stern widow named Mrs. Gable, whose eyes followed Eleanor with a hawk's unnerving focus. The other servants, a handful of quiet, nervous girls and weathered ranch hands, treated her with a formal, distant respect that bordered on fear. They saw her not as a person, but as the master's property, a fragile, expensive new fixture in the house. Silas himself was a creature of habit. He rose before the sun, spent his mornings hunched over his massive oak desk in a study that smelled of leather and stale cigar smoke, the scratch of his pen on the ledger a constant, rhythmic sound. In the afternoons, he would walk the grounds, leaning heavily on a thick hickory cane, his cold eyes missing nothing, not a loose fence post, not a lame horse, not a moment of perceived idleness from his workers. He moved with the slow, deliberate pace of a man who owned the very earth beneath his feet and never let anyone forget it. His interactions with Eleanor were perfunctory, devoid of any warmth. He never touched her, not even a simple brush of the hand as they passed in the hall. At the dinner table, he spoke of cattle prices, of disputes with smaller homesteaders, of the coming winter. He would ask her if the kitchen was well stocked or if a servant had been insubordinate, his questions feeling more like an audit than a conversation. He looked at her, but he did not see her. He saw a placeholder, a functionary, the young, healthy womb he had purchased to secure his legacy. The nights were a silent continuation of the days, his brief, impersonal visits to her side of the bed conducted with the same detached efficiency as his business dealings, leaving her feeling colder and more alone than before. Weeks bled into a month. The monotony was a slow-acting poison, dulling her senses, sanding away the sharp edges of her grief until all that remained was a flat, gray ache. It was this ache that drove her to the stables. She had learned to ride as a child, on a gentle old farm horse, and she craved the simple freedom of it. Silas had granted her permission, assigning her the tamest mare, a placid creature named Daisy. "Stay within sight of the house," he had commanded, his tone leaving no room for argument. For a time, she obeyed, riding in circles around the main compound, always under the watchful eyes of the ranch hands or Mrs. Gable on the porch. But one clear, bright afternoon, a rebellious spark flickered to life within her. The distant hills, a rumple of brown and purple rock at the edge of Silas's vast domain, called to her. With a furtive glance back at the silent, imposing house, she urged Daisy into a canter, heading away from the prescribed path, her heart thumping with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. The further she rode, the wilder the land became. The flat plains gave way to a broken, arid country of dry washes and rocky outcrops. The air grew stiller, the silence deeper. This was a land that did not belong to Silas Blackwood. It belonged only to itself, lost in the feeling of escape. She wasn't paying attention to the terrain. Daisy's hoof slipped on a patch of loose shale. The mare whinnied in alarm, stumbling hard. Eleanor, caught off guard, was thrown from the saddle, landing with a cry of pain as her left ankle twisted violently beneath her. She lay on the ground for a moment, the hot sun beating down on her, the air knocked from her lungs. A sharp, searing pain shot up her leg. Daisy, recovering her footing, stood a few feet away, trembling but unharmed. Eleanor pushed herself up, her face pale. When she tried to put weight on her foot, a wave of agony and nausea washed over her, and she sank back to the dusty ground, tears of frustration and pain welling in her eyes. She was alone, injured, and hopelessly lost. It was the lowing of cattle that she heard first, a peaceful sound in the oppressive silence. Then came a man's voice, low and calm. Speaking to the animals, a figure on horseback appeared on the ridge of the hill above her. He paused, a silhouette against the blinding sky, before making his way down the rocky slope with a practiced ease. As he drew closer, she saw he was young, perhaps only a few years older than herself. He was lean and long-limbed, dressed in worn denim and scuffed leather boots. A dusty hat was pulled low over his eyes, but she could see a face tanned by the sun and a jawline that was firm and resolute. He swung down from his horse before it had fully stopped, moving with a fluid grace that spoke of a life spent in the saddle. "You all right, ma'am?" he asked. His voice was quiet, a low drawl that was somehow gentle. "I think so," she stammered, trying to hide her tear-streaked face. "My horse stumbled. It's my ankle." He knelt beside her without a word, his presence calm and reassuring. "Mind if I take a look?" She nodded mutely. His hands were calloused and sun-browned, but his touch was surprisingly careful as he examined her boot. He worked it off gently, his fingers probing the swelling flesh with a focused expertise. "It's a bad sprain," he said, his eyes meeting hers for the first time. They were a startling hazel, flecked with green and gold, and held a deep, settled weariness that seemed at odds with his age. They were the eyes of a man who had seen too much. "You can't put weight on it. You're a long way from the Blackwood place." "I know. I got lost," she admitted, feeling foolish. He gave a slight nod, offering no judgment. He stood and walked to his horse, pulling a canteen from the saddle. He brought it to her, and she drank the cool, slightly metallic water gratefully. Then, he took a clean kerchief from his neck and, soaking it with water, wrapped it carefully around her swollen ankle. The coolness was a blessed relief. He was resourceful and self-contained, a world away from any man she had ever known. He wasn't broken like her father or domineering like her husband. He was simply present. "I'm Luke," he said, as if it were an afterthought. "Eleanor." He helped her to her feet, his arm strong and steady around her waist, allowing her to lean on him as she hopped to where Daisy stood. He easily lifted her into the saddle, his movements efficient and respectful. He took the reins of both his horse and hers and began the slow walk back, leading her out of the rocky maze. They didn't speak much. The silence between them was comfortable, a shared space in the vast wilderness. Eleanor, perched on her horse, watched him, the straight line of his back, the easy way he moved across the difficult ground. For the first time in months, she felt something other than fear or despair. It was a flicker of warmth, of human connection. It was nearly dusk when the imposing shape of the Blackwood ranch house came into view. Silas was on the porch, a stiff, dark figure waiting for them. His face was like a thundercloud. As they approached, his voice cracked across the yard like a whip. "Where in God's name have you been, woman?" Luke brought the horses to a halt, but did not release the reins. "She had a fall. Sir, her horse stumbled up in the hills. I was bringing her back." Silas's eyes, like chips of obsidian, raked over Luke, taking in his worn clothes, his lean frame, and the small herd of cattle grazing on the disputed patch of land in the distance. His lip curled in a sneer. "The hills? I gave you an order. And you," he spat, his gaze fixing on Luke, "are trespassing on my land with your scrawny cattle. Get off my property, now." "I was just seeing the lady home safe," Luke said, his voice even, his gaze steady. "She does not require the help of a squatter," Silas snarled. He strode forward, grabbing Eleanor's arm and hauling her roughly from the saddle. She cried out as her injured foot hit the ground. Silas ignored her, his grip tightening like a vice. "Get inside the house." He shoved her toward the door. He turned back to Luke, his face contorted with rage. "If I see you or your animals on this side of the creek again, I'll have my men run you out. Do you understand me?" Luke's jaw tightened, but he simply gave a slow, deliberate nod. He tipped his hat slightly in Eleanor's direction, a gesture of farewell that only she saw, then mounted his horse and rode away, not looking back. For the next 3 days, Eleanor did not leave the house. Her meals were brought to her room. Mrs. Gable tended to her ankle with cold, efficient hands, her silence a heavy blanket of disapproval. Silas did not speak to her. His punishment was not in words or violence, but in absolute isolation. The world shrank to the 4 walls of her bedroom, but something within her had irrevocably shifted before the fall. The house had been a prison surrounded by a meaningless wasteland. Now, it was a prison that held her from something specific. From her window, she could just see the hazy line of the rocky hills where she had met him. She found her eyes drawn there constantly, tracing the rugged slopes against the sky, the memory of Luke's quiet voice, his gentle hands, his weary, kind eyes, was a secret she held tight in the lonely silence. It was a dangerous, fragile thing, that memory, but it was hers, out there, in the vast, unforgiving desert of her life. She had found a single, tiny spring of hope, and she guarded it with all her might. The confinement had been a form of slow starvation, not of the body, but of the soul. After her period of isolation ended, Silas allowed Eleanor to ride again, but his unspoken warning hung in the air, thick and suffocating. A new fear rode with her, a fear of being watched, yet a stronger, more insistent force pulled at her, the memory of a quiet man with weary, kind eyes. It became an obsession, a secret compass pointing her toward the rocky hills. She began to rise in the pre-dawn chill, when the air was still and cool and the sky was a soft, pearly gray. She told Mrs. Gable she was searching for wild herbs, yarrow for fevers, chamomile for sleep, an excuse plausible enough to grant her a small measure of freedom. Each morning, she would saddle Daisy and ride out, not directly toward the hills, but in a wide, meandering loop that brought her closer to the boundary creek, the line Silas had drawn between his world and Luke's. She told herself she was merely exploring, that she was seeking solace in the quiet solitude of the dawn, but in the most honest corners of her heart, she knew she was searching. The hope of seeing him was a small, warm coal she nurtured in the cold emptiness of her life. It was on the 4th morning that she found him, a ribbon of clear water. The very creek that marked the disputed border wound its way through a small copse of cottonwoods. He was there, standing knee-deep in the stream, his back to her. He was washing his horse, a handsome buckskin, running a cloth over its powerful shoulders with slow, methodical strokes. The scene was one of profound peace. The horse stood patiently, trusting, and Luke's movements were gentle, respectful. It was a relationship of quiet partnership, so starkly different from Silas's view of animals and people as mere assets to be managed and controlled. She reined Daisy in, her heart suddenly a frantic drum against her ribs. She could turn back, she could ride away, and he would never know she'd been there. But she stayed, a silent observer under the canopy of the cottonwoods. He must have sensed her presence, for he paused and turned his head slowly. His eyes found her in the shadows. There was no surprise in his expression, only a quiet, steady recognition, as if he had been expecting her. He finished his task, led the horse to the bank, and walked toward her, wiping his wet hands on his denim trousers. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said, his voice as calm as the morning air. "Please," she said, her own voice softer than she intended. "Call me Eleanor." He nodded. Eleanor. Her name on his lips sounded simple and right. "You're a long way from the house again." There was no accusation in his tone, only observation. "I was looking for herbs," she said, the lie feeling flimsy and foolish. He glanced at the empty leather pouch on her saddle. His gaze was not unkind. "Find any?" She felt a blush creep up her neck. "No, not yet." A comfortable silence fell between them, filled only by the gentle gurgle of the creek and the soft stamp of a horse's hoof. It was he who broke it. "Your ankle," he said, nodding toward her foot. "It healed all right?" "Yes, thank you. It was. You were very kind that day." "Anyone would have done the same." "My husband doesn't think so," she said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Luke's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his hazel eyes, a deep, knowing sorrow. He didn't press her. Instead, he changed the subject. "This is good water here. Runs clean. My cattle do well on it." He looked out over the small herd grazing peacefully on the other side of the creek. "Blackwood thinks the water belongs to him, too." "He thinks everything belongs to him," she said, her voice laced with a bitterness that surprised her. The conversation flowed more easily after that. She stayed on her horse, and he stood by its head, his hand resting gently on Daisy's neck. She learned that he wasn't a squatter, as Silas had claimed. He held the title to his small parcel of land, legally filed, but Silas was challenging it, using his wealth and influence to tie it up with lawyers and threats. He was trying to squeeze Luke out, just as he had done to countless others. "Why do you stay?" she asked. "Why not just move on? There's so much land out here." He looked away, his gaze settling on the distant horizon. "Running's easy," he said quietly. "I've done my share of it. A man's got to stop somewhere, make a stand on a piece of ground he can call his own." He looked back at her, and for the first time, she saw a shadow of his past. "I used to ride for pay, for the army, mostly, as a scout. You see things, in that life, things that make you tired of fighting other men's battles." He paused, the memory clouding his face. "I saw good men die for a line on a map, for an order from a man they'd never met. I decided if I was ever going to fight again, it would be for something that was mine." He spoke of it plainly, without self-pity, but she could hear the ghosts in his voice. She pictured him younger, caught in the chaos and violence of a world she couldn't imagine, and understood the profound stillness he now carried with him. It wasn't emptiness. It was a hard-won peace. Her own story came tumbling out then, not in a rush, but in quiet, halting sentences. She didn't speak of the wedding, or of the cold nights in the big, silent house. She spoke of the feeling. "It's like being a piece of property yourself," she confessed, her eyes on her hands, which were twisting the reins. "To be looked at, valued, and purchased. To have your life decided for you, not by you, to feel like you're not really living your own life at all." He listened. He didn't interrupt, didn't offer platitudes or advice. He just stood there, his presence a solid, comforting anchor in her turbulent sea of emotions. When she finally fell silent, her confession hanging in the air between them, he simply nodded, a slow, understanding gesture that said more than any words could. He saw her. In that moment, she felt seen in a way she never had before. Another morning, a few days later, they met again at the same spot, but the weather had turned. The sky was a bruised, heavy purple, and the air was thick with the smell of rain. They spoke for only a few minutes when the first fat drops began to fall. Within moments, the drizzle turned into a torrential downpour. The wind howled, whipping the rain into stinging sheets that soaked them instantly. "We have to get out of this," Luke shouted over the roar of the storm. "My cabin's not far. It's closer than the ranch." A chill was already setting deep into her bones. She hesitated for only a second before nodding. He took Daisy's reins and led her at a trot up a narrow path she hadn't seen before, away from the creek and into the shelter of the low hills. His cabin was little more than a one-room shack, built of rough-hewn logs and tucked into a small, protected hollow. But inside, it was clean and dry. A simple cot stood against one wall, a stone fireplace against the other. There was a small table, 2 chairs, and a few shelves holding tins of food and a handful of books. It was the home of a man who needed little. He moved quickly, stabling the horses in a small lean-to, then returning to build a fire. Eleanor stood shivering in the middle of the small room, water dripping from her hair and clothes onto the wooden floor. He handed her a rough wool blanket from his cot. "Get out of that wet dress," he said, his back to her as he coaxed the flames to life. "You'll catch your death." His tone was practical, not forward, and she felt no fear, only a deep, trembling cold. She wrapped the blanket around herself and, with the numb fingers, unbuttoned her sodden dress, letting it fall in a puddle at her feet. She huddled by the nascent fire, the wool scratching her skin, as he hung her dress on a peg near the hearth to dry. The storm raged outside, a wild symphony of wind and rain. Inside, the only sounds were the crackle of the fire and their soft breathing. The small space was filled with a palpable intimacy. He sat in one of the chairs, and she sat on the floor, huddled in the blanket, drawn to the growing warmth of the flames. The firelight cast flickering shadows on the walls and danced in his hazel eyes as he watched her. The world outside ceased to exist. There was no Silas, no ranch, no debt, no duty. There was only the storm, the fire, and the two of them, isolated in this small, safe pocket of the world. Her shivering began to subside, replaced by a different kind of trembling that started deep within her. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and in the space between them, an unspoken truth was finally acknowledged. He moved from his chair to kneel in front of her. He didn't touch her. He just looked at her, his face serious, his eyes asking a question she had no answer for. She saw her own loneliness, her own longing, reflected there, slowly, as if moving through water. He leaned forward. His lips met hers. It was not a kiss of passion, but of discovery. It was hesitant, gentle, and achingly tender. It tasted of rain and wood smoke and a profound, shared solitude. For a single, breathtaking moment, Eleanor felt not like property, not like a wife, not like a daughter, but like herself. A warmth spread through her chest, a feeling so powerful and so terrifying it stole her breath. It was she who broke it. The reality of what she was doing crashed down on her with the force of the storm outside. She was a married woman. This was a sin. This was a betrayal. This was a path that led only to ruin. She pulled back abruptly, her eyes wide with a mixture of wonder and horror. A strangled sob escaped her lips. Before Luke could speak, before he could move, she scrambled to her feet, clutching the blanket around her. She grabbed her still damp dress from the peg, not caring that it was cold and wet. "I can't," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I have to go." She fled from the cabin, out into the heart of the storm. She didn't look back as she fumbled with Daisy's saddle, her hands trembling too much to properly manage the straps. She just ran, propelled by a tidal wave of guilt and fear, and a terrifying, exhilarating joy that she knew would destroy her. The memory of the kiss was a brand on her lips. It did not fade. In the cold, silent halls of the Blackwood Ranch, Eleanor could feel its warmth, a secret, terrifying heat that she carried within her. Her flight from Luke's cabin had been an act of pure, instinctual panic, a desperate retreat back to the safety of her cage. Safety, she discovered, was just another word for misery. She threw herself into the prescribed emptiness of her days with a feverish energy. She polished silver that was never used for company. She mended linens with stitches so small they were nearly invisible. She oversaw the kitchen with a stern focus that unnerved the servants. She did anything to fill the roaring silence in her mind, to keep from thinking about the man in the hills. She stopped her dawn rides entirely. The very direction of the creek was a torment to her, a magnetic pull she had to fight with every fiber of her being. She willed herself to forget his hazel eyes, the gentle strength in his hands, the taste of rain on his lips. But the harder she tried, the more vivid the memory became. A profound and suffocating melancholy settled over her. The vibrant, desperate girl who hauled water under a punishing sun was gone, replaced by a pale, silent woman who drifted through the grand house like a ghost. She ate little, spoke less, and her eyes held a distant, haunted look. Silas noticed the change. He noticed everything. He was a man who took inventory of his possessions, and his new wife was no exception. He saw the untouched food on her plate, the new shadows under her eyes, the way she flinched if he entered a room too suddenly. He did not see a suffering woman. He saw a flawed asset, a machine that was beginning to run improperly. His suspicion, once aroused, was a cold and patient thing. It began to coil around her. He no longer allowed her to ride out alone, not even within the confines of the main yard. One of his more brutish ranch hands, a man named Jed with small, cunning eyes, was always assigned to accompany her. Jed never spoke, but she could feel his gaze on her back, constant and assessing. The world, which had briefly opened to the size of a rain-swept cabin, had now shrunk to the size of a prison yard. The air grew thin, and she felt she could not breathe. The need to give voice to the storm inside her became unbearable. She could not speak to a soul in this house, but she could write, in the dead of night, by the light of a single, sputtering candle in her room. She took a sheet of Silas's expensive stationery and poured her heart onto the page. It was not a letter she ever intended to send. It was a prayer, a confession, a desperate cry into the void. She wrote to Luke. She wrote of the kiss, of the shame and the terror, and of the beautiful, aching warmth it had ignited within her. She apologized for running, explaining the tidal wave of guilt that had overwhelmed her. She wrote of her life in the house, of the crushing loneliness. She did not write the words, "I love you," but the sentiment was in every stroke of the pen, in the very water of the ink. She finished the letter, her hand trembling, and folded it. With no place to hide it, she tucked it between the pages of the small Bible on her nightstand, a book she had not opened in months. It was a foolish, reckless act, born of desperation. The next morning, a young maid named Clara, tasked with dusting the master bedroom, found it. The girl was barely 16, with a perpetually frightened look. She saw the folded paper. Her curiosity piqued. She read it. The words made her blood run cold. Torn between a flicker of pity for her young mistress and a deep, abiding terror of Silas Blackwood, Clara made the only choice a servant in that house could make. She took the letter straight to Mrs. Gable, who in turn delivered it to Silas in his study. The confrontation came at dinner. The silence in the dining room was absolute, broken only by the clink of silverware against porcelain. Eleanor had been pushing a piece of roast beef around her plate for 10 minutes. Silas sat at the head of the table, watching her, his face an unreadable mask of stone. Finally, he placed his knife and fork down with a deliberate click. He slid the letter across the polished wood of the table. It stopped just short of her plate. "I believe this is yours," he said, his voice dangerously soft. Eleanor stared at the folded paper. The blood drained from her face. Her breath caught in her throat. "You have been entertaining yourself," he continued, his voice still quiet, but with a hard, metallic edge. "With a squatter, my property, consorting with a thief who grazes his cattle on my land." It is not what you think," she stammered, her hands trembling in her lap. "Is it not?" He rose from his chair, his bulk seeming to suck the very air from the room. He walked around the table until he stood directly behind her. "You have disgraced me. You have brought your filth into my home. I bought you, I paid a debt to own you, and this is how you repay me, by behaving like a common harlot?" His hand shot out, not in a fist, but in a hard, open-handed slap. The crack of it against her face was like a gunshot in the silent room. Her head snapped to the side, her ear ringing, the coppery taste of blood instantly filling her mouth. Tears of shock and pain sprang to her eyes. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh like talons, and hauled her from the chair. He dragged her out of the dining room, through the kitchen where the servants scattered like frightened mice, and out the back door. He pulled her across the yard to a small, windowless building set apart from the others, the grain shed. He wrenched the heavy wooden door open, revealing a wall of absolute blackness that smelled of dust, chaff, and the sharp scent of rodent droppings. "You will stay in here," he hissed, his face close to hers, his breath foul. "You will stay in here and contemplate the meaning of your vows and the consequences of breaking them." He shoved her inside. She stumbled and fell to the hard-packed dirt floor. The door slammed shut, plunging her into a disorienting, total darkness. The heavy bar dropped into place on the outside, the sound echoing with a dreadful finality. She was alone in the cold and the black, with nothing but the sound of her own ragged breathing and the faint, terrifying scurrying of rats in the walls. For 2 days. Luke rode to the creek at dawn and found nothing. The silence where Eleanor should have been was unsettling. By the 3rd day, his unease had curdled into a cold certainty that something was wrong. He was a scout by training, a man who read signs the way others read books. He left his cattle and circled wide, keeping to the cover of the hills, his eyes fixed on the Blackwood Ranch. He watched the rhythm of the place, the comings and goings of the hands. He saw no sign of Eleanor. That evening, he saw Jed, the brutish hand, walk to the grain shed, unlock the heavy bar, place a bucket of water and a piece of bread on the floor just inside, and lock it again. It was enough. Luke waited until the moon was high and the main house was dark, moving like a shadow. He slipped into the ranch yard, his knife in his hand. The bar on the shed was thick, but the iron hasp it sat in was old. Using his knife as a lever, he worked it patiently, silently, until the screws, rusted and worn, gave way. He pulled the door open a crack. "Eleanor?" he whispered into the darkness. A faint sob was his only answer. He swung the door open and stepped inside, pulling it shut behind him. He struck a match, the sudden flare of light revealing a pitiful sight. She was huddled in the corner, her dress torn and filthy, her face streaked with dirt and tears. There was a dark, ugly bruise on her cheek. She looked up at him, her eyes wide and full of a despair so profound it struck him like a physical blow. "Luke," she breathed, her voice a raw croak. He crossed the space in 2 strides and knelt before her, extinguishing the match. He gathered her into his arms. She was as light as a child, and trembling uncontrollably. "I'm getting you out of here," he said, his voice a low, fierce growl. They fled into the night, Eleanor riding in front of him on his horse, wrapped in his coat. They rode hard and fast, not toward his cabin but west, into the Badlands, toward the ghost of a town that had gone bust a decade before. They found shelter in a derelict warehouse, its roof full of holes that let the moonlight stream in like silver pillars. He built a small, smokeless fire in the center of the vast, empty space. He had water in his canteen and a little dried jerky, which he made her eat. She huddled under his coat, the violent shivering finally subsiding as the warmth of the fire seeped into her bones. She told him everything, the letter, the confrontation, the shed. When she was done, a heavy silence settled between them, filled with the crackle of the fire. "He would have left me there to rot," she whispered, staring into the flames. "I am nothing to him. Less than his horse. Less than his dog. Just a thing he owns." She looked up at Luke, her eyes shining with unshed tears in the firelight. "When you kissed me, that was the first time I felt like a person. Not a daughter, not a wife, just me." Her voice grew stronger, fueled by the truth she was finally allowing herself to speak. "It's not just you, Luke. It's the feeling of being free, of making a choice. I want to live. I don't want to just exist in that man's house until I fade away." He moved to sit beside her, his presence solid and comforting. The space between them hummed with unspoken words, with months of repressed longing and shared loneliness. The walls she had built around her heart, the vows she had taken, the guilt that had tormented her, it all crumbled to dust in the face of her reality. He was life, and Silas was a slow death. She leaned toward him, her hand coming up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. He closed his eyes at her touch. In that moment, there was no right or wrong, no sin, no virtue. There was only a man and a woman, stripped of everything but their desperate need for one another. The last of their restraint fell away. It was a kiss not of tender discovery, but of fierce, desperate claiming. It was a collision of hunger and solace, a frantic attempt to erase the cold of the shed, the sting of the slap, the weight of their lonely lives. They came together on the dusty floor of the abandoned warehouse, their movements urgent and elemental. It was a night of ferocious, despairing passion. A single brilliant flame of defiance against the darkness that was certain to consume them. They found in each other not just pleasure, but a profound and fleeting sanctuary, a moment of pure, unadulterated life. But as the first pale light of dawn crept through the holes in the roof, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, a sound shattered their fragile peace, the heavy warehouse door, which they had barred from the inside, crashed open with a splintering roar. Silhouetted against the morning glare stood Jed and 3 other men, their faces grim, their hands holding rifles. The world dissolved into a maelstrom of brutal, chaotic violence. Luke moved with a desperate, feral grace, a cornered animal fighting for his mate. The first man through the door met a fist that snapped his head back with a sickening crack, but there were too many of them. Jed, with a cruel grin, brought the heavy stock of his rifle down on Luke's shoulder, forcing him to his knees. Another man kicked his legs out from under him. Eleanor screamed, a raw, ragged sound torn from her throat, but it was lost in the grunts of the men and the sickening thud of a rifle butt against bone. Luke didn't cry out, but a guttural cry of pain was forced from his lungs as they set upon him with a methodical, vicious efficiency, their boots and fists rising and falling. Eleanor tried to fight, to claw at them, but Jed grabbed her, his thick arm locking around her waist, lifting her off the ground as she struggled. "That's enough, boys," Jed grunted, his breath hot and sour on her neck. "The boss wants him alive, just taught a lesson." He dragged her away, her eyes fixed on Luke's crumpled form on the dusty floor. He was a broken mess of blood and bruises, but as Jed pulled her through the splintered doorway, his eyes fluttered open and met hers. In them, she saw not defeat, but a silent, burning promise. She was taken back to the ranch, not as a wife, but as a prisoner of war. The story, twisted and shaped by Jed's telling, spread through the small town of Redemption Creek like a prairie fire. It was whispered over sacks of flour in the general store, mumbled over glasses of whiskey in the saloon, and clucked over by the church ladies on Sunday. The narrative was simple and damning. The ungrateful young wife of the town's most powerful man had run off with a common squatter, a known troublemaker. She was a brazen harlot, an adulteress who had shamed her generous husband. The pity the townsfolk once felt for her curdled into righteous scorn. She was no longer a victim. She was a disgrace. Her new prison was her own bedroom. Silas, in a display of cold, calculated rage, had new, heavier locks installed on the inside and outside of her door. He did not beat her again. His cruelty was more refined now. He would sit in a chair in her room for an hour each evening, polishing a handgun, the soft clicks of the mechanism the only sound in the oppressive silence. "You have made your choice," he told her one evening, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "You chose the gutter. If you attempt to leave this house again, I will not fetch you back. I will have you charged. Adultery is a crime. So is abandoning your husband. The law is on my side. The town is on my side. I will see you put in a territorial prison, where you will rot with criminals and degenerates. Your lover, the squatter, will be charged with horse theft and kidnapping. They hang men for less. Your fate, and his, is in your hands. Behave, and you may live out your days in comfort. Defy me, and I will destroy you both." His words were bars of iron, colder and stronger than any physical restraint. Despair became her constant companion. She would stand at her window for hours, looking out at the distant hills, her heart a leaden weight in her chest. Was Luke alive? Had they left him to die in that abandoned warehouse? The uncertainty was a torment worse than any punishment Silas could devise. Her only human contact was with Mrs. Gable, who brought her meals with a stony, disapproving silence, and Clara, the young maid who cleaned her room. Clara had been terrified when she delivered the letter, but seeing Eleanor's bruised face and the new locks on the door had planted a seed of defiant pity in her young heart. One afternoon, as she was changing the linens, Eleanor took the greatest risk of her life. She pressed a folded scrap of paper into the girl's hand, a note she had written with a piece of charcoal on the back of a page torn from her Bible. "Please," Eleanor whispered, her voice hoarse from disuse. "For the love of God, please get this to him, to Luke. His cabin is by the creek, at the edge of the hills." Clara's eyes widened in terror. She looked from the note to the locked door, her whole body trembling. They'll send me away, ma'am, or worse." "No one will know," Eleanor pleaded, her fingers clutching the girl's arm. "Please, I just need to know if he's alive." The girl hesitated for a long moment. Then, with a sharp, frightened nod, she tucked the note into the pocket of her apron and fled the room. Luke was alive. He had drifted in and out of consciousness for what felt like days, finally managing to drag his broken body onto his horse and make the agonizing journey back to his cabin. He had 2 broken ribs, a dislocated shoulder, and a face that was a swollen, purple mask. He tended to his injuries himself, with the grim practicality of a man long accustomed to pain. He set his own shoulder with a strangled cry, gritting his teeth against the white-hot agony. He bound his ribs with strips of cloth. For a week, he did little more than drink water, swallow bits of jerky, and drift in and out of feverish sleep. Eleanor's terrified face haunting his dreams. They had beaten his body, but they had forged his will into something harder than steel. The quiet man who just wanted to be left alone was gone. In his place was a man with a singular, burning purpose. It was Clara who found him, 10 days after the beating. She had slipped away from the ranch on a fabricated errand and found the cabin, her heart pounding with fear. She delivered the note and a small pouch containing a healing salve she had stolen from the kitchen. Luke read the charcoal scrawl. "Are you alive? I am a prisoner. Forgive me. E." And the last of his apathy was burned away. He knew he could not storm the ranch. That would be suicide, and it would doom Eleanor. Silas was right about one thing. He had the law, the money, and the town on his side. Luke knew he had to fight him not with fists, but with a truth that was sharper than any knife. His first visit was to the town's preacher, Reverend Miller. He was a timid man, with watery eyes and a perpetual air of apology. Luke found him in his small, dusty church. "Blackwood has my wife," Luke said, getting straight to the point. "He's holding her against her will." "His wife," the Reverend corrected weakly. "She is his wife. My son. The law." The law calls what he did to me attempted murder. The law calls holding a person captive kidnapping. He is not above God's law, Reverend, or is he? Luke's gaze was intense. I know he donated the lumber for this church. I know he fills your collection plate. But you hear things. You take confessions. You know the man he is. You know about the homesteaders he's cheated, the families he's run off their land. The Reverend flinched, his gaze falling to the worn Bible in his hands. He was a man trapped between his conscience and his fear. Luke's next stop was at a small house at the edge of town, where Elias Thorne, the former sheriff, lived. Thorne was an old man now. His back stooped, but his eyes were still sharp. He had been a good lawman until he'd crossed Silas Blackwood over a water rights dispute a decade ago. He'd found himself voted out of office in the next election, replaced by a man firmly in Blackwood's pocket. Luke laid out the entire story. Thorne listened patiently, puffing on his pipe, his expression unchanging. When Luke was finished, the old man was silent for a long time. He owns the town. Son, Thorne said finally. The judge, the sheriff, the mayor, they all eat at his table. Your word against his won't mean a thing, especially not with you being involved with his wife. It won't just be my word, Luke said. He leaned forward, his voice low and urgent. You know the families he's ruined, the Schmidts, the Garcias. He foreclosed on them with papers that weren't legal. You told me so yourself once. You know where the proof is. You were the sheriff. You know his crimes. A flicker of the old lawman sparked in Thorne's eyes. He saw in Luke a determination he hadn't seen in this town for a very long time. What you're planning is dangerous. Blackwood will crush you. He's already tried, Luke said, a humorless smile touching his bruised lips. It's time someone tried to crush him back. With the truth. With the law he likes to hide behind. A plan began to form. A desperate gambit whispered in the dusty confines of the old sheriff's house. It was a plan that relied on finding the courage of broken men, on piecing together a case from old files and older grievances. A plan to turn Silas's own weapon, the law, against him. Back at the ranch, Eleanor's world had shrunk, but her body was undergoing a secret, seismic change. A week after her capture, a strange queasiness began to plague her in the mornings. At first, she dismissed it as a symptom of her despair, but then she began to count the days, a cold, terrifying, and yet fiercely joyful realization dawned on her. The night in the warehouse, their one desperate act of love, had left its mark. She was pregnant. She sat on the edge of her bed, her hands protectively covering her still flat stomach. In the midst of her hopeless imprisonment, a new life was growing inside her. It was Luke's child. It was a secret she had to guard with her life, for it was both a death sentence and her only reason to live. It was a flicker of impossible joy in the suffocating darkness, a bittersweet promise of a future she might never see. The arrival was not a clandestine rescue in the dead of night, but a formal declaration of war in the broad, unforgiving light of day. Luke rode up the long drive to the Blackwood Ranch not on his own horse, but in a dusty buggy, with Elias Thorne sitting ramrod straight beside him. They didn't stop at the stables, but pulled up directly in front of the wide porch where Silas was taking his morning coffee. Silas rose, his face darkening with a mixture of surprise and contempt. "Thorne, I thought you'd had the good sense to die already. And you," he sneered, his eyes locking on Luke. "Have a gall I almost admire. Jed," he bellowed. But before any ranch hands could appear, Thorne held up a hand, and from his coat, he produced a sheaf of official-looking documents. "That won't be necessary." "Silas," the old lawman said, his voice stronger than it had been in years. "This isn't a social call. This is a legal matter." Luke stepped down from the buggy, his movements still stiff, but his resolve like iron. His face was a tapestry of fading bruises, a testament to Silas's brutality. He walked up the steps and placed the papers on the table next to Silas's coffee cup. "This is a lawsuit." "Blackwood," Luke said, his voice clear and steady. "Filed with the territorial court for assault, for unlawful seizure of property, and for fraud. The Schmidt family is signed on. So have the Garcias, and so have I." Silas stared at the papers, then laughed, a short, ugly bark. "You think this paper will scare me? I own the judge in this town." "The case won't be heard by Judge Miller," Thorne said calmly. "We filed a petition with the circuit judge, citing a conflict of interest. Judge Allister will be presiding. He arrives on the stagecoach tomorrow." He paused, letting the weight of the name settle. Judge Allister had a reputation for being fiercely independent and immune to the influence of local cattle barons. He has also issued a subpoena for Eleanor Blackwood to appear as a witness. If she is not in that courtroom, you will be charged with contempt and obstruction. For the first time, Eleanor saw a flicker of genuine uncertainty in her husband's cold eyes. He was a king on his own land, but they had dragged the fight onto a different field of battle, one governed by rules he could bend, but perhaps not entirely break. The trial was held in the town's largest building, the saloon, which had been cleared of its tables and smelled of stale beer and sawdust. The entire population of Redemption Creek seemed to be packed inside, their face a sea of morbid curiosity. They craned their necks for a look at Luke, standing with Thorne on one side, and Silas, flanked by a portly, slick-looking lawyer from Cheyenne, on the other. The air was thick with whispers, with the weight of judgment. Eleanor was escorted into the room by the new, impartial sheriff Judge Allister had brought with him. She walked through the silent, parting crowd, feeling the burn of 100 pairs of eyes. They were not looking at a woman, they were looking at a scandal. She took her seat on a hard bench behind Luke, her hands clenched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. Silas sat across the aisle, his gaze fixed on her, a silent, venomous promise of retribution. She could feel his threat like a physical chill, a cold hand on the back of her neck. The trial began with Thorne laying out the case against Silas, presenting documents he had kept from his time as sheriff, deeds with forged signatures, loan agreements with predatory terms, sworn affidavits from families who had been run off their land years ago. The murmur in the crowd shifted from gossip to something more unsettled. These were stories they all knew, but had never dared speak aloud. Then, Silas's lawyer, a man named Abernathy, rose to cross-examine. He didn't challenge the documents. Instead, he attacked the credibility of the primary plaintiff. He called Luke to the stand and, with a sneer, painted him as a violent drifter, a squatter with a grudge, and a man who preyed on lonely, impressionable women. Finally, they called her name, Eleanor Blackwood, to the stand. Her legs felt weak as she walked to the witness chair. The sheriff administered the oath, and she placed her hand on the Bible, her fingers trembling. Abernathy approached her, his smile condescending. "Mrs. Blackwood," he began, his voice oozing a false sympathy. "You took a sacred vow before God to honor and obey your husband, did you not?" "I did," she whispered. "A husband who provided you with a fine home, with beautiful clothes, with a life of comfort you could only have dreamed of. Is that not so?" "Yes." "And yet you chose to betray that vow. You ran from this comfortable home, from this generous man, and into the arms of that man." He gestured dismissively toward Luke. "Tell me, Mrs. Blackwood, what hold did he have over you? What promises did this penniless drifter make to lure you from your marital bed?" Eleanor's throat was dry. She looked at Luke, who met her gaze with a look of unwavering support. She looked at Silas, whose eyes were boring into her, cold and menacing. "He made me no promises," she said, her voice barely audible. "No promises?" Abernathy feigned surprise. "Then you simply left your husband for a moment of cheap passion? You threw away your reputation, your security, your honor, For a sordid tryst in an abandoned shack? His voice rose, dripping with scorn. Are you telling this court that you are nothing more than a common faithless harlot? The word hung in the stifling air. Harlot. It was the word the town had been whispering. It was the brand Silas had tried to burn into her. In that moment, something inside Eleanor snapped. The fear that had held her captive for months was incinerated by a sudden, white-hot blaze of anger. She had been bought, beaten, and locked away. She had been shamed and threatened. She would not be silent any longer. She straightened her back, lifting her chin, and her eyes, clear and defiant, swept over the faces in the courtroom, the smug lawyer, the stony-faced judge, the whispering townspeople. Finally, she looked directly at Silas. No, she said, her voice ringing out, clear and strong, silencing the room. I am not. She turned her gaze to Abernathy. You speak of my husband's generosity. I was not his wife. I was a payment for a debt. He gave me a house, but it was a prison. He gave me clothes, but they were a costume. He gave me comfort, but it was the comfort of a well-kept animal in a cage. She stood up from the witness chair, her hands no longer trembling. You ask what Mr. Luke gave me. He gave me nothing that can be bought or sold. He gave me kindness when all I knew was cruelty. He listened when no one else would. He saw a person when my own husband saw only a possession. Tears welled in her eyes, but they were not tears of shame. They were tears of pure, unadulterated truth. You ask if I betrayed my vows. My vows were made to a man I did not know, for a life I did not choose. They were chains, not promises. Yes, I went to Luke. And yes, she said, her voice softening as she finally turned her eyes to him, a look of profound and unwavering love passing between them. I love him. I do not regret it. In that abandoned warehouse, with nothing, I felt more alive and more human than I ever did in my husband's grand house. If that makes me a sinner in your eyes, then so be it. But in my own heart, for the first time in my life, I felt free. She sat back down. A stunned silence held the courtroom in its grip. She had not denied the accusations. She had redefined them. She had taken their ugly words and transformed them into a declaration of independence. The verdict, when it came an hour later, was a compromise. Judge Allister, faced with Thorne's irrefutable evidence of land fraud, found Silas guilty of multiple contract violations. He was ordered to pay significant restitution to the families he had cheated and to surrender the disputed title to Luke's land. His business dealings were to be placed under the review of a territorial marshal. He was not sent to jail, but his iron grip on the town had been fractured. It was a legal victory, but as Eleanor and Luke left the saloon, they felt the chill of a different kind of judgment. The townspeople who had won back their money and their land averted their eyes. The women pulled their children closer, whispering behind their hands. They had won the court case, but they had lost the town. Her reputation, and by extension, his, was permanently stained. They were outcasts. That evening, in Luke's small, quiet cabin, they stood by the window, watching the sun set, painting the sky in brilliant strokes of orange and purple. The beauty of it was sharp and painful. We can't stay here, Eleanor said softly, her hand moving unconsciously to rest on her abdomen, where their secret was safely kept. The whispers will never stop. The looks, this will never be our home. Luke turned and put his arms around her, pulling her close. He rested his chin on the top of her head. Then we'll find a new home, he said, his voice a low, steady rumble against her ear. Someplace where no one knows our names, someplace where we can just be, we have each other. That's all the home we need. She leaned into his embrace, breathing in the scent of him, of pine and dust and clean air. He was right. They had lost everything, family, home, reputation, but in doing so, they had won the only thing that truly mattered, each other, and the freedom to build a life on their own terms. They left Redemption Creek with little more than the clothes on their backs, a single horse, and the small pouch of restitution money Silas had been forced to pay Luke. They traveled west, away from the flat, judgmental plains, and towards the jagged, anonymous peaks of the distant mountains. For weeks, they moved, seeking a place that felt not just safe, but clean, a place where the air wasn't thick with the ghosts of their past. They found it in a small, hidden valley, a bowl of green cupped in the hands of granite mountains. A clear, fast-running river cut through its center, and the slopes were thick with pine and aspen. It was a wild, untamed place, but it was theirs, here. No one knew their names or their story. They were Adam and Eve in a new, rugged Eden. Their first home was a simple lean-to, but their first project was a cabin. The work was brutal, relentless, and the most joyful either of them had ever known. Luke, with an axe that seemed an extension of his arms, felled pine trees, his muscles straining, his body gleaming with sweat. Eleanor worked alongside him, clearing brush, stripping logs, and mixing mud and moss to chink the walls. They worked from sunrise to sunset, their hands becoming calloused and strong, their bodies lean and hard. As the walls rose, log by painstaking log, they were not just building a shelter. They were building a life, a fortress of their own making against the world they had left behind. Life settled into a simple, peaceful rhythm. Luke was the hunter, disappearing into the high country for days at a time, always returning with deer or rabbit slung over his shoulder, his presence filling their small cabin with a quiet, solid warmth. Eleanor was the gardener. She tilled a small plot of land near the river, her hands in the rich, dark soil, coaxing life from the earth. She planted corn, beans, and squash, and lined their small window with pots of the wild herbs she had once used as an excuse to find Luke. Their days were a partnership, a silent dance of shared purpose. There was a starkness to their existence. Their plates were tin, their cups carved from wood. They had one heavy wool blanket to share on their simple rope bed. But this poverty was a kind of wealth. They were rich in the things that mattered: freedom, peace, and a deep, unspoken understanding that flowed between them like the river outside their door. For Eleanor, the memory of Silas's grand, suffocating house was like a fever dream. The clink of her tin cup against the rough-hewn table held more happiness than all the polished silver and fine china in the world. They were truly, profoundly happy. As the summer swelled, so did Eleanor. The secret she had carried within her became a visible truth, her belly growing round and firm beneath her simple calico dress. The morning sickness passed, replaced by a sense of radiant, blooming life. She felt a connection to the earth she worked, a shared purpose of nurturing and growth. Luke watched her with a mixture of awe, tenderness, and a deep, gnawing anxiety. He had never imagined himself a father. He, who had walked away from the world of men, was now tethered to the future by this new life. He would often stop his work and just watch her as she weeded the garden or kneaded bread, a look of profound, incredulous emotion on his face. He was terrified. Their isolation, which had been a comfort, now seemed a terrible liability. They were days from any town, miles from any doctor. The fear for her, for the child, was a constant, low hum beneath his happiness. But their private moments were filled with a sweet, aching beauty. In the evenings, as they sat before the fire, he would kneel before her and place his rough, calloused hand on her belly. He would hold it there for long minutes, his eyes closed in concentration, a look of wonder spreading across his face as he felt the flutter of movement, the hiccup, the strong, insistent kick of his child. It was a miracle that left him speechless. "He's a fighter," he'd murmur, a slow smile spreading across his lips. "Like his mother." "Or stubborn, like his father," she would retort, running her fingers through his hair. They found joy in the wilderness that surrounded them. On hot afternoons, they would go down to the river, to a secluded pool sheltered by willows. There, they would shed their clothes and slip into the cool, clear water. The harshness of their life would wash away, leaving only the simple pleasure of the sun on their skin and the water sluicing over their bodies. They would swim and splash, their laughter echoing in the quiet valley. Two souls finding a perfect, private paradise. She would watch him, his lean, scarred body so beautiful and strong, and he would look at her, her pregnant form radiant in the dappled sunlight, and they would both feel a gratitude so immense it felt like a prayer. The first sign of the storm came as summer began to wane. The sky, for days, had been a strange, bruised yellow. The air grew heavy and still, the usual drone of insects falling silent. The animals knew. Luke saw the deer moving down from the high country, seeking shelter. It hit in the middle of the night. It began with a low moan of wind that quickly escalated into a deafening, demonic howl. Rain came not in drops, but in solid, horizontal sheets that hammered against their small cabin. Thunder cracked directly overhead, the sound so violent it shook the very logs of the walls. Eleanor, now heavy in her 8th month, woke with a start, her heart pounding. Luke was already up, barring the door, checking the window shutter. For hours, they huddled together on the cot, the wind screaming like a banshee, the cabin groaning under the assault. This was not a normal storm. It was a force of pure, elemental fury, intent on scouring the mountains clean. Around 3 a.m, a massive pine tree that stood sentinel on the slope above their cabin finally surrendered its hold, with a sound like a cannon shot. Its roots tore from the saturated earth. It fell with a deafening, splintering crash, directly onto their home. The roof above them exploded inward in a shower of splintered logs, mud, and pine needles. The impact threw them from the bed. Luke instinctively twisted, shielding Eleanor with his own body as they hit the floor. The world was a chaotic nightmare of roaring wind, hissing rain, and the groan of collapsing timbers. When the initial chaos subsided, they were alive. Trapped in the one corner of the cabin that had held, a massive log lay where their bed had been moments before. Rain and wind poured through the gaping hole in the roof. Luke pushed himself up, his face bleeding from a cut on his forehead. "Eleanor, are you hurt?" I don't think so," she gasped, her body trembling with shock. But as he helped her up, a sharp, searing pain shot through her lower back, a tightening in her belly so fierce it stole her breath. She cried out, clutching her stomach, her eyes wide with terror. It was not the cramp of a fall. It was a pain she knew, instinctively, was something else. As the first contraction seized her, she knew it was too soon. "Luke," she panted, her face pale in the faint light of the dying embers in the hearth. "The baby! It's coming!" Panic, cold and absolute, seized him. He looked at her, then at the ruined cabin, then out at the black, howling maw of the storm. The nearest help, a midwife an old trapper had once told him about, was in a mining settlement on the other side of the mountain pass, in good weather. It was a hard day's ride. In this storm, it was a suicide mission, but the alternative was unthinkable. He made his decision. He helped her to the driest corner of the room, propping her up with their one remaining blanket. His movements were frantic, but his voice was steady, masking his terror. "I have to go for help. Eleanor, I have to. You stay here. Keep the fire going if you can." "No, Luke, don't leave me," she cried, clinging to his hand, another wave of pain making her gasp. He knelt, his bleeding face inches from hers, his eyes wild with a desperate love. "I will be back. I swear to you on my life. I will be back with help." He kissed her hard, a frantic, desperate press of his lips against hers. Then he was gone. She heard him fighting with the debris at the door, then the whinny of his terrified horse. Through the roar of the storm, she heard the frantic beat of hooves, a sound that grew fainter and fainter until it was swallowed completely by the wind and the rain. She was alone, in labor, in a ruined cabin, with the wilderness raging around her. The world had shrunk to the 4 ruined corners of the cabin and the raging universe of pain inside her body. Time ceased to be linear, measured not in minutes or hours, but in the relentless, cresting waves of contractions. Each one was a white-hot tide, pulling her under, demanding every ounce of her strength, leaving her gasping on the shore of a few moments' peace before the next one gathered and broke. The storm outside was a distant, meaningless roar compared to the tempest tearing her apart from within. She was utterly alone. The fire had been extinguished by the rain pouring through the roof, plunging her into a near-total darkness broken only by a frantic, jagged lightning that illuminated the wreckage in stark, terrifying flashes. Cold water soaked the blanket she lay on, chilling her to the bone. She thought of Luke, a desperate, frantic prayer. Was he alive? Had the storm taken him? The fear for him was a pain sharper than the labor, a blade twisting in her heart. But she could not afford that fear. To surrender to it was to die. So she focused. She focused on the life she had chosen, on the feel of Luke's hand on her belly, on his slow, wondering smile. She focused on the child, this fierce, fighting creature who was her son, their son, a testament to a single night of desperate love. She was not the purchased bride of Silas Blackwood anymore. She was Eleanor, a woman who had chosen to live, and she would not let her child be born into a world without his mother. The hours blurred into a primal, agonizing struggle. She cried out, the sound swallowed by the wind. She pushed, her body screaming in protest, her muscles tearing. It was a battle fought in blood and darkness, a raw, elemental war between life and death. And then, with one final, soul-splitting effort, there was a release, a sudden, shocking emptiness. A thin, fragile cry cut through the howl of the storm. She fumbled in the darkness, her hands finding the small, slippery body. A boy, her son, overwhelmed with a love so fierce it was a physical pain. She pulled him to her chest, trying to shield him from the cold rain with her own body. But her relief was immediately swallowed by a new, more terrifying sensation. A gush of warmth. Too much, too fast. The bleeding wasn't stopping. She felt her own life force draining out of her, pouring into the cold mud of the cabin floor. She was so tired. Her vision began to tunnel, the edges turning gray. The baby's cries grew faint, as if coming from a great distance. It was the sound of a horse, a desperate driving sound that pierced through the fog. Then Luke's voice, shouting her name, raw with terror. The ruined doorway was filled with his silhouette, and behind him, a small, bundled figure of a woman. Luke was at her side in an instant, his face a mask of horror in the lantern light the woman carried. He saw the baby, so small and pale, and he saw the blood. The woman, old and weathered, with a face like a dried apple, pushed past him. "Out of the way, boy!" she snapped, her voice surprisingly strong. This was Martha, the midwife. She knelt, her experienced hands assessing the situation in a single, grim glance. She worked quickly, her movements efficient and sure, packing cloths, muttering to herself. Luke gathered his son, wrapping the shivering infant in his own dry coat. The baby was so impossibly light, his tiny face screwed up in a silent cry. But Luke's eyes were on Eleanor. Her skin was a waxy, translucent white, her lips blue. Her eyes were closed. "Is she—" He couldn't finish the sentence. Martha didn't look up from her work. "She's lost too much blood. The babe came too early and too hard." She shook her head, a gesture of grim finality. "I've seen this a dozen times. There's nothing more I can do. It's in God's hands now." Luke felt the world crumble beneath him. He had ridden through hell, his horse collapsing from exhaustion a mile from the mining camp, forcing him to run the rest of the way. He had begged, threatened, and promised this woman his last dollar to come back with him. He had faced down Silas's men, had survived a beating that should have killed him, had built a new life from nothing. For this, to watch the only light in his world extinguish in a ruined cabin? He knelt beside Eleanor, his son held tight against his chest. He touched her face. It was so cold. "Eleanor," he choked out, his voice breaking. "Don't you leave me. Don't you dare leave me. We're not done yet. You and me. We're just getting started." And somewhere, in the deep, gray place where she was drifting, she heard him. His voice was a lifeline, a thread of warmth in the encroaching cold. She had not come this far, fought this hard, only to be extinguished by the indifferent cruelty of fate. She had chosen to love. She had chosen to live. It was a choice she had to make one last time. With a will forged in poverty and honed in defiance, she fought. She clawed her way back from the edge, pulled by the sound of her lover's voice and the faint, mewling cry of her newborn son. When she opened her eyes, the storm had passed. Pale morning light streamed through the hole in the roof. Luke was asleep in a chair beside her, his head slumped forward, his face etched with exhaustion and grief, cradled in his arms, wrapped in his coat, was their son. Martha, the midwife, was stoking the fire, which now burned warm and bright. "Well now," the old woman said, a look of grudging respect in her eyes. "Ain't seen one come back like that in 20 years. You're a stubborn one." Eleanor lived. She was weak, a ghost of herself for many weeks, but she lived. Luke nursed her with a fierce, tender devotion, feeding her broth, cleaning her wounds, never leaving her side. He cared for the baby, whom they named Caleb, with a clumsy but profound love. The first time he placed Caleb in her arms, Luke watched, his heart in his throat. Eleanor looked at the tiny, perfect face, the small rosebud mouth, the tuft of dark hair, and a tear of pure, unadulterated joy traced a path down her cheek. Later that day, as Eleanor and the baby slept, Luke sat on the floor, holding his son. He looked at the tiny, grasping fingers, the impossibly small features. This was his child, a part of him, a part of the woman he loved. He, Luke, the discarded soldier, the lonely drifter who believed he was destined to walk the earth alone, who felt he deserved nothing good, was a father. A wave of emotion so powerful it buckled his knees washed over him. He bowed his head, and for the first time since he was a boy watching his own family be buried, Luke wept. He cried silent, ragged, cleansing tears for the man he had been, for the pain he had known, and for the incredible, undeserved grace of the family he now held in his arms. He finally felt worthy. Autumn painted the valley in hues of gold and amber. The cabin was rebuilt, stronger than before, its new logs a testament to their resilience. The roof was sound, the walls were secure. It was a home. One evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, painting the western sky in streaks of fiery red and deep purple, Eleanor sat in a rocking chair Luke had made, their son sleeping peacefully on her chest. Caleb was healthy and strong, a happy, gurgling baby who was the center of their universe. Outside, Luke was finishing the last section of a new fence, the steady, rhythmic thud of his hammer a comforting, domestic sound. He was not fencing anything out, but fencing them in, creating a boundary of safety and belonging. She watched him, her husband in all but name, his strong back outlined against the brilliant, fading light. The air was crisp, smelling of pine and wood smoke. This life was hard. It was simple. It was stripped of all but the essential, and it was more beautiful than anything she had ever dared to dream. She looked down at the child in her arms. This perfect, tangible proof of their love. A profound peace settled over her, a quiet, unshakable sense of rightness. "I was once forced to live as others wanted," she thought, her eyes on Luke as he turned and smiled at her, a smile that reached all the way to his soul. But now, I live as myself. Thank you for listening to our story tonight around the Wild West Campfire. We'd love to know where you're tuning in from. So drop a comment down below and let's connect. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts. We've always got another story waiting to be told.